Hello and welcome back to Megawatts on Your Mind. This is Lighthief, and today we're doing something different. We're not discussing markets, technologies, or O&M practices. Instead, we're telling a story. The story of a Polish scientist whose accidental discovery in 1916 made modern photovoltaics possible. A man whose name most people in solar energy have never heard, but whose method produces the silicon wafers in virtually every high-efficiency solar panel manufactured today. His name was Jan Czochralski, and in a Berlin laboratory over a century ago, he discovered a method for growing single crystals that would eventually revolutionize semiconductors, electronics, and renewable energy. The Czochralski process, pulling single crystals from molten material, is how we produce the monocrystalline silicon that dominates modern photovoltaics. Without Czochralski's discovery, solar panels as we know them would not exist. This is personal for me. I'm Polish. Lighthief operates across Europe, but our roots are in Poland. And I've recently established the Czochralski Artificial Intelligence and Renewable Energy Sources Institute, CAIRES, specifically to honor this connection between Polish scientific innovation and the future of renewable energy. The name is deliberate. Czochralski gave us the foundation of modern solar technology. Now we need to combine that legacy with artificial intelligence, blockchain, and emerging technologies to advance renewable energy further. But who was Jan Czochralski? What led to his discovery? How did a method for growing tin crystals become the foundation of the silicon industry? What was his life like beyond this single discovery? And why does his story matter for people working in renewable energy today? These aren't just historical curiosities. Understanding where our technologies come from, appreciating the human stories behind scientific breakthroughs, recognizing that today's renewable energy industry stands on foundations built by people who lived through very different times. This provides perspective and humility. We're not creating something from nothing. We're building on generations of scientific work, often by people whose contributions are forgotten or unknown. Today, we'll explore Czochralski's life comprehensively. His early years in Poland under partition, his education and early career in Germany, the famous discovery in 1916, the development and applications of his method, his life during the interwar period and World War II, his tragic death, and his lasting legacy. We'll explain how the Czochralski process actually works and why it's essential for photovoltaics. And we'll discuss why his story matters today for an industry that often focuses entirely on the future while forgetting the past. This episode is for anyone in solar energy who wants to understand the scientific foundations of their industry, for people interested in the history of technology, for Polish listeners who might not know about their countrymen's contribution to renewable energy, and for anyone who appreciates that behind every technology are human stories of curiosity, accident, persistence, and sometimes tragedy. Shall we begin? And perhaps appreciate that the solar panels generating clean electricity today owe their existence to a moment of clumsiness in a laboratory in 1916. Jan Czochralski was born on October 23, 1885 in Kenia, a small town in the region of Greater Poland, then under Prussian control. This historical context is important. Poland did not exist as an independent country during Czochralski's youth. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had been partitioned by Russia, Prussia, and Austria in the late 18th century. Poland would not regain independence until 1918 after World War I. Growing up Polish under Prussian rule meant navigating cultural and political tensions. The Prussian authorities pursued Germanization policies, pressuring Polish populations to adopt German language and culture. Polish identity was maintained through family, church, and underground education. For a young man with scientific interests, this meant his education would be in German institutions, within the German scientific community. We know relatively little about Czochralski's childhood and early education. Historical records from this period for someone of his background are sparse. What we know is that he showed early interest in science and pursued education despite the challenges facing Polish youth under partition. Czochralski's formal education began in earnest when he attended the Technische Hochschule in Berlin-Charlottenburg, the Technical University of Berlin, one of the leading technical institutions in Europe at that time. He studied chemistry and metallurgy, fields that were advancing rapidly in early 20th century Germany as industrialization accelerated. Germany at this time was a scientific powerhouse. German universities and technical institutes were world leaders in chemistry, physics, engineering. The culture of rigorous scientific research, practical application, and close connection between academia and industry created an environment where talented young scientists could flourish. Czochralski completed his studies and began his career in industrial chemistry. His early work focused on metals and metallurgy, understanding the properties of metals, developing alloys, improving industrial processes. This was practical science with commercial applications, not pure theoretical research. By the 1910s, Czochralski was working at the Metallbank und Metallurgische Gesellschaft in Frankfurt, a metalworking company. He was conducting research on metal crystallization, trying to understand how metals solidify from liquid to solid state and how crystal structure affects material properties. This work may seem removed from solar energy, but understanding crystal structure is fundamental to material science. The properties of metals and semiconductors depend critically on their crystal structure. Pure single crystals have different properties than polycrystalline materials or amorphous materials. For applications requiring specific electrical, thermal, or mechanical properties, controlling crystal structure is essential. Czochralski's research focused particularly on tin and other metals used in industrial applications. He was investigating how to produce metal crystals with controlled properties, how to measure crystal purity, how crystallization processes could be optimized. It's important to understand the scientific context of the early 20th century. The atomic theory of matter was relatively new and still developing. The understanding of crystal structure at the atomic level was emerging through X-ray crystallography, pioneered by Max von Laue and the Braggs in the 1910s. The quantum mechanical understanding of how electrons behave in crystalline materials wouldn't be developed until the 1920s and 1930s. Scientists like Czochralski were working at the frontier of material science, developing empirical understanding through experimentation even as the theoretical foundations were still being established. They were learning by doing, by careful observation, by systematic variation of conditions. In 1916, Czochralski was conducting experiments on tin crystallization in his laboratory in Frankfurt. He was 31 years old, an experienced metallurgical researcher, working on problems that seemed far removed from world-changing discoveries. World War I was raging across Europe. The scientific community was disrupted, but work continued. And then, according to the story that has become legendary, an accident occurred that would change the trajectory of material science and ultimately enable the semiconductor industry and renewable energy technologies. The story of Czochralski's discovery is one of the great accidents in scientific history, comparable to Alexander Fleming's discovery of penicillin or Percy Spencer's discovery of microwave heating. It demonstrates that scientific breakthroughs often come from unexpected observations by prepared minds. The traditional story, which has been told and retold in various versions, goes something like this. Czochralski was working late in his laboratory, conducting experiments on molten tin. He had crucibles of molten metal at high temperatures. He was taking notes, making measurements, fully absorbed in his work. At some point, and accounts vary on exactly how this happened, he accidentally dipped his pen into the molten tin instead of the inkwell. When he pulled the pen out, expecting to find it ruined, he noticed something remarkable. A thin thread of solidified tin had formed on the pen tip. But this wasn't just ordinary solidified metal. When he examined it carefully, he realized it was a single crystal. The tin had crystallized in an organized, uniform structure rather than the polycrystalline structure typical of normally solidified metals. Now, like many legendary scientific discovery stories, the exact details have probably been embellished over retellings. Whether it was actually a pen, whether it was truly an accident or a deliberate experiment, whether the immediate recognition of the crystal structure was instant or came after analysis. These details are lost to history or conflated in various accounts. What matters is what Czochralski recognized and what he did next. He realized that this pulling method, extracting solid crystal from molten material, could be a way to grow controlled single crystals. This was scientifically interesting and potentially practically valuable. Czochralski systematically investigated this phenomenon. He experimented with different pulling speeds, different temperatures, different materials. He developed understanding of how the crystal growth process worked. When you pull from molten material at a controlled rate, the atoms solidify in an ordered structure, continuing the crystal lattice of the seed crystal or initial solidified portion. The key is controlling the temperature gradient and pulling rate, so solidification occurs in a controlled manner. He published his findings in 1918 in the Zeitschrift für Physikalische Chemie, the Journal of Physical Chemistry. The paper, titled Ein neues Verfahren zur Messung der Kristallisationsgeschwindigkeit der Metalle, which translates to A New Method for the Measurement of the Crystallization Velocity of Metals, described the method and its application to studying metal crystallization rates. The title is revealing. Czochralski initially framed his discovery as a measurement technique, a way to study how fast metals crystallize, rather than as a crystal production method. He recognized the scientific value for studying crystallization processes. But the broader implications for producing large, high-purity single crystals would become apparent later. The method itself is elegant in its simplicity. You have molten material in a crucible heated to above its melting point. You introduce a seed crystal or initiate solidification on a rod. You slowly pull upward while rotating. As you pull, material solidifies onto the growing crystal in a controlled manner. The temperature must be carefully controlled. The melt must be hot enough to remain liquid, but the crystal must be cool enough to solidify. The pulling rate determines the crystal diameter and growth rate. This basic principle, controlled pulling of single crystals from molten material, is the Czochralski process. In 1916, it was an interesting metallurgical technique. Within a few decades, it would become essential for the electronics industry. And today, it's how we produce most of the silicon wafers used in photovoltaics. But the path from Czochralski's tin crystals to modern silicon wafers took decades and required contributions from many other scientists and engineers. Czochralski had discovered the method, but its full potential wouldn't be realized during his lifetime. It's worth noting that Czochralski didn't personally profit substantially from his discovery. The Czochralski process is named after him, but it was developed and commercialized by others. This is not uncommon in science. The discoverer often doesn't reap the economic benefits. Czochralski was a salaried researcher, not an entrepreneur. His reward was scientific recognition, not wealth. The timing of the discovery is also interesting. 1916 was mid-World War I. Scientific communication was disrupted by the war. The full dissemination and appreciation of Czochralski's work was delayed until after the war ended. In a more peaceful time, perhaps the significance would have been recognized faster. But even after the war, the immediate applications were limited. The electronics industry that would make the Czochralski process essential didn't exist yet. The first transistor wouldn't be invented until 1947. The semiconductor industry wouldn't emerge until the 1950s. The photovoltaic effect had been discovered in the 19th century, but practical solar cells wouldn't be developed until the 1950s. Czochralski had discovered a method that was ahead of its time, waiting for the technologies that would need it. After his discovery, Czochralski continued his scientific career, though his life became increasingly complex as historical events unfolded around him. In 1918, Poland regained independence after World War I. For Czochralski, now 33 years old, this meant a choice. He had built his career in Germany, spoke fluent German, worked in German institutions. but he was Polish by birth and identity. What would he do? Czochralski chose to return to Poland. In 1929, after spending the 1920s continuing his research in Germany, he accepted a position as professor at the Warsaw University of Technology, one of Poland's leading technical institutions. He would spend much of the interwar period in Poland, contributing to Polish scientific development while maintaining connections to the international scientific community. During the 1920s and 1930s, the Czochralski process began to find applications beyond Czochralski's original crystallization studies. Researchers used it to grow single crystals of various metals and compounds for scientific research. The method provided a way to produce crystals with known, controlled properties for studying material behavior. But the breakthrough that would make the Czochralski process truly important was happening in a different field: semiconductor physics. In the 1940s and 1950s, researchers developing transistors and other semiconductor devices realized they needed high-purity single-crystal silicon and germanium. Semiconductor properties depend critically on crystal purity and structure. Impurities and crystal defects dramatically affect electrical properties. The first transistor, invented at Bell Labs in 1947 by John Bardeen, Walter Brattain, and William Shockley, used germanium. Early transistors were made from germanium crystals grown by various methods. But silicon would eventually prove superior for most applications. Higher temperature tolerance, more abundant, easier to manufacture into devices. Growing high-purity single-crystal silicon was challenging. Silicon melts at 1414 degrees Celsius, requiring specialized high-temperature equipment. Contamination from crucible materials was a problem. Controlling crystal diameter and defects required precise temperature control and pulling rates. In 1950, Gordon Teal at Bell Labs successfully applied the Czochralski process to grow single-crystal silicon ingots. This was the breakthrough that would transform the method from laboratory curiosity to industrial necessity. Teal and colleagues refined the process, developing techniques for controlling crystal orientation, diameter, and purity. The method they developed is essentially what's used today for producing silicon wafers, though refined and scaled up enormously. You start with high-purity polycrystalline silicon. You melt it in a quartz crucible at around 1450 degrees Celsius in an inert atmosphere or vacuum to prevent contamination. You introduce a seed crystal of silicon with desired crystal orientation. You slowly pull upward while rotating the seed, typically a few millimeters per minute. The molten silicon solidifies onto the growing crystal ingot. You control temperature precisely to maintain proper growth rate and diameter. The resulting ingot is a single crystal of silicon, typically 200 to 300 millimeters in diameter and 1 to 2 meters long in modern production. This ingot is then sliced into thin wafers, typically 180 to 200 micrometers thick for solar applications. These wafers are the starting material for photovoltaic cells. The Czochralski process produces what we call monocrystalline silicon. The entire wafer is one continuous crystal lattice with uniform atomic arrangement. This uniformity is why monocrystalline silicon solar cells achieve higher efficiencies than polycrystalline. The electrons can move through the material with less scattering and recombination. Modern solar-grade silicon production is sophisticated and capital-intensive. The Czochralski pulling machines are computer-controlled with precise temperature management and atmosphere control. The process takes 20 to 40 hours to grow a complete ingot. Yields must be high because the input material and process costs are substantial. The irony is that Czochralski worked with tin, which melts at just 232 degrees Celsius. Silicon melts at 1,414 degrees Celsius, more than 6 times hotter. Applying Czochralski's method to silicon required decades of materials science and engineering development to handle the extreme temperatures, prevent contamination, control defects, and scale to industrial production. There were alternatives to the Czochralski process. The float zone method, developed in the 1950s, produces even higher purity silicon, but is more expensive and limited to smaller diameters. For most photovoltaic applications, Czochralski silicon offers the best balance of quality, cost, and scalability. Today, the majority of silicon solar cells worldwide use Czochralski monocrystalline wafers. The global solar industry produces hundreds of gigawatts of capacity annually. Tens of millions of silicon wafers are manufactured, and each one traces back to the pulling method a Polish scientist discovered with tin in 1916. Jan Czochralski himself never knew his discovery would enable the photovoltaic industry. He died in 1953, just as silicon transistors and the first practical silicon solar cells were being developed at Bell Labs. The connection between his 1916 discovery and modern renewable energy would only become clear in the decades after his death. But what happened to Czochralski after his discovery? His life story took tragic turns that reflect the tumultuous history of Central Europe in the 20th century. Jan Czochralski's life after his discovery was marked by scientific achievement, but also by the catastrophic events that engulfed Poland and Europe in the 1930s and 1940s. In Poland during the interwar period, Czochralski was a respected scientist and professor. He continued research on metals and materials science. He trained students at Warsaw University of Technology. He published scientific papers and maintained connections to the international metallurgical community. By all accounts, he was a dedicated scientist and educator. Czochralski's work extended beyond the crystal growing method. He contributed to understanding of metal alloys, corrosion processes, and various aspects of physical chemistry and metallurgy. He held numerous patents for industrial processes. He was recognized as one of Poland's leading materials scientists. But the shadow of coming war hung over Europe through the 1930s. When World War II began with Nazi Germany's invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, Czochralski's life was upended, like millions of others. The German occupation of Poland was brutal and murderous. The Nazis implemented policies of extermination toward Jews, mass murder, and deportation of Polish intelligentsia, and brutal suppression of any resistance. Universities were closed. Scientists and intellectuals were targeted for elimination as part of the Nazi plan to destroy Polish culture and enslave the population. What happened to Czochralski during the war is controversial and not entirely clear from historical records. What is known is that he remained in Warsaw during much of the occupation. He was not deported to camps. He survived the war, unlike many Polish scientists and intellectuals who were murdered. There are accounts that Czochralski was involved with the Polish resistance, helping to protect Jews and other persecuted people. Some sources claim he used his connections and position to shield people from Nazi persecution. Other accounts are more ambiguous or contradictory about his wartime activities. What complicated Czochralski's legacy was that he apparently had some contact with German authorities during the occupation. The nature and extent of this contact and whether it constituted collaboration or was necessary for survival and to protect others became matters of intense controversy in post-war Poland. After the war ended in 1945, Poland came under Soviet domination. The new communist authorities investigated many people who had remained in occupied Poland, suspecting collaboration. Czochralski was among those investigated. The post-war treatment of Czochralski was harsh. He was accused of collaboration with the Germans, though the evidence appears to have been ambiguous or circumstantial. He lost his university position. His reputation was damaged. His scientific contributions were downplayed or ignored in Poland for decades. The truth about Czochralski's wartime actions may never be fully known. Surviving such an occupation while maintaining any position or resources inevitably meant some accommodation with the occupiers. Distinguishing between collaboration, survival, and resistance is complex when records are incomplete and motivations are unclear. What is clear is that Jan Czochralski spent his final years in reduced circumstances. He died on April 22, 1953, in Poznan, Poland, at age 67. He was buried quietly. His death received little attention. The man whose discovery would eventually enable the semiconductor and solar industries died largely forgotten, his reputation under a cloud. For decades after his death, Czochralski's name was rarely mentioned in Poland. The communist authorities weren't interested in celebrating someone investigated for collaboration. His family suffered from the association. His scientific legacy was acknowledged internationally. The Czochralski process bore his name in scientific literature, but in his home country he was largely erased. It was only decades later, after the fall of communism in 1989, that historical reassessment began. Researchers investigated wartime records more carefully. Testimonies emerged suggesting Czochralski had indeed helped protect people during the occupation. His scientific contributions were re-examined and celebrated. Today, Czochralski is recognized in Poland as an important scientist whose discovery made major technological advances possible. His wartime experiences are understood in the context of impossible moral choices faced by people living under brutal occupation. Streets and institutions bear his name. His legacy has been rehabilitated, but the tragedy remains. A man who made a discovery that would eventually benefit humanity, who contributed to science and education, whose method would enable technologies he never imagined, spent his final years marginalized and his reputation destroyed. He never knew that the Czochralski process would become essential for photovoltaics and renewable energy. He died without recognition for what his discovery would ultimately mean. This is not uncommon in scientific history. Many discoverers don't live to see the full implications of their work. Many suffer from historical injustices or personal tragedies unrelated to their scientific achievements. But Czochralski's story is particularly poignant because his final years were so difficult while his scientific legacy was becoming increasingly important. Let's bring this story to the present and explain exactly how the Czochralski process enables modern photovoltaics, because understanding this connection helps us appreciate what Czochralski's discovery means for renewable energy. The foundation of a silicon solar cell is the silicon wafer. Most high-efficiency solar cells today use monocrystalline silicon wafers produced by the Czochralski process. The global production capacity for Czochralski silicon is enormous, hundreds of thousands of tons annually, produced primarily in China, but also in other countries. The modern Czochralski pulling process for solar silicon works as follows. First, high-purity polycrystalline silicon is produced through chemical processes from quartz. This polysilicon is purified to remove impurities to parts per billion levels. Solar-grade silicon requires purity of 99.9999% or higher, 6 nines as it's called in the industry. The polysilicon chunks are loaded into a quartz crucible and melted at around 1,450 degrees Celsius. The melting happens in an inert atmosphere or vacuum to prevent oxidation and contamination. The molten silicon glows bright orange-red from the intense heat. A seed crystal of silicon with the desired crystal orientation is slowly lowered until it touches the molten surface. The seed crystal is typically oriented to produce either 100 or 111 crystal orientation, which affects the resulting electrical properties. The seed is slowly pulled upward while being rotated, typically at a few RPM. The pulling rate is precisely controlled, typically 1 to 2 millimeters per minute initially, faster later. As the seed is pulled, molten silicon solidifies onto it, continuing the crystal lattice structure of the seed throughout the growing ingot. The temperature must be carefully controlled. The crucible temperature, ambient temperature, pulling rate, and rotation rate all affect the crystal diameter and quality. Modern Czochralski machines use sophisticated computer control with feedback from temperature sensors and optical measurements of crystal diameter. Doping elements are added to the melt to create the desired electrical properties. For solar cells, boron is typically added to create P-type silicon or phosphorus for N-type silicon. The doping concentration must be controlled precisely, typically 1 dopant atom per million silicon atoms. The process takes 20 to 40 hours to grow a complete ingot. The resulting cylindrical ingot is typically 200 to 300 millimeters in diameter and 1 to 2 meters long, weighing hundreds of kilograms. These dimensions have grown over time. Early ingots were much smaller. The industry continues pushing toward larger diameters to improve economies of scale. Once the ingot is grown and cooled, it goes through several processing steps. The ends are cut off and recycled. The cylindrical ingot is often cropped to create pseudo-square cross-sections that pack more efficiently into solar panels. The ingot is then sliced into thin wafers using wire saws, basically wires coated with abrasive that cut through silicon like cheese slicers. The wafers are typically 180 to 200 micrometers thick for solar applications, less than 1/4 of a millimeter. Achieving such thin wafers without breakage requires precision and creates substantial material loss as kerf, the material removed by the cutting process. Recent advances use thinner wires and more efficient cutting to reduce kerf loss. The wafers are then processed through multiple steps to create solar cells, surface texturing to reduce reflection, diffusion of dopants to create the p-n junction, deposition of anti-reflection coatings and contacts, testing, and sorting. The resulting cells are assembled into modules with encapsulation and framing. The efficiency advantages of monocrystalline Czochralski silicon are substantial. Commercial monocrystalline cells achieve efficiencies of 22 to 24% in mass production, with record cells exceeding 26%. Polycrystalline silicon cells made from less expensive but lower quality material achieve 18 to 20% efficiencies. This efficiency difference matters enormously for system economics. Higher efficiency means less area needed for the same power output, reducing balance of system costs, mounting structures, wiring, land use, installation labor. For utility-scale projects, the premium price for monocrystalline wafers is more than offset by balance of system savings and increased production. The modern solar industry produces roughly 400 to 500 gigawatts of solar modules annually as of 2023 to 2024. Perhaps 90% of this capacity uses monocrystalline Czochralski silicon. That's hundreds of millions of wafers, all produced using the method Czochralski discovered in 1916. The capital investment in Czochralski pulling equipment globally is enormous, tens of billions of dollars. A single modern Czochralski puller costs several $1 million. The largest silicon producers operate hundreds of pullers running continuously. The production of solar-grade Czochralski silicon is one of the largest applications of the method, exceeding even semiconductor electronics in volume. Alternatives to Czochralski silicon exist. Multicrystalline or polycrystalline silicon can be produced by simpler casting methods at lower cost but lower efficiency. Thin film technologies like CDTE or CIGS don't use crystalline silicon at all. Perovskite solar cells currently in development might not require Czochralski silicon, but for the foreseeable future, Czochralski monocrystalline silicon will remain dominant in photovoltaics. The irony is elegant. A method discovered for studying tin crystal growth, developed initially for germanium transistors, adapted for silicon semiconductors, now produces the vast majority of solar cells generating renewable energy worldwide. Czochralski's accidental discovery in 1916 enables gigawatts of clean energy production in 2024. So we've explored Jan Czochralski's life and legacy, his early years in partitioned Poland, his education and career in Germany, his famous discovery in 1916, the development of his method for silicon production, his tragic later life and death, and the connection to modern photovoltaics. What should we take from this story? First, scientific breakthroughs often come from unexpected observations. Czochralski's discovery emerged from an accident, but his prepared mind recognized its significance. This combination of chance and readiness characterizes many important discoveries. We should create environments where accidents can lead to insights rather than just problems to be corrected. Second, the path from discovery to application can be long and indirect. Czochralski discovered his method in 1916. It wasn't applied to silicon until the 1950s. Solar cells using Czochralski silicon weren't commercialized until the 1970s to 80s. The massive scale application to renewable energy happened in the 2000s to 2020, nearly a century from discovery to full realization. Patience and long-term thinking matter in science and technology. Third, discoverers often don't benefit from or even see the ultimate impact of their work. Czochralski died in 1953, just as his method was being applied to silicon. He never saw solar panels using his process. He never knew his discovery would enable renewable energy. Recognition and reward are often delayed or absent entirely. We should honor the contributions of those who came before, even when they didn't receive credit during their lifetimes. Fourth, individual lives are shaped by historical forces beyond their control. Czochralski's later years were overshadowed by war, occupation, and post-war political turmoil. His scientific achievements couldn't protect him from historical catastrophes. This reminds us that science and technology exist within human societies, subject to political, economic, and social forces. Fifth, rehabilitation and recognition can come eventually. After decades of being forgotten or stigmatized, Czochralski's contributions are now properly recognized. His name is celebrated in Poland and internationally. This offers hope that historical injustices can be corrected, though tragically after the person is gone. For those of us working in renewable energy today, Czochralski's story reminds us that we stand on foundations built by countless people across decades or centuries. The solar panels we install, maintain, and depend on for clean energy incorporate discoveries from physics, chemistry, materials, science, engineering, contributions from thousands of scientists and engineers, most of whose names we'll never know. This is why I established CAIRES, the Czochralski Artificial Intelligence and Renewable Energy Sources Institute, to honor this connection between Polish scientific innovation and the future of renewable energy. To recognize that the next breakthroughs might come from unexpected places and people. To combine the foundation Czochralski provided with modern technologies like AI and blockchain to advance renewable energy further. The Institute is deliberately named to connect past and future. Czochralski gave us the method that makes modern solar possible. Now we must build on that legacy, combining it with artificial intelligence to optimize renewable energy systems, blockchain to enable distributed energy trading, and other emerging technologies to accelerate the energy transition. Czochralski's story also reminds us that scientific progress is international. He was Polish by birth, educated in Germany, published in German journals, and his method was developed by American scientists and commercialized globally. Science transcends borders. The solutions to climate change and the energy transition will come from global collaboration building on contributions from all countries and cultures. In future episodes, we'll return to our usual topics: markets, technologies, operations, practical business realities of renewable energy. But occasionally, we need to look backward to appreciate how we got here. The solar industry sometimes acts like it invented everything yesterday. In reality, we're building on centuries of scientific work. This is Lighthief, reminding you that every solar panel generating clean electricity today contains within it the legacy of a Polish scientist who died largely forgotten, but whose accidental discovery in 1916 made it all possible. Jan Czochralski deserves to be remembered and celebrated by everyone working in photovoltaics. His discovery quite literally made our industry possible. Until next time, may your monocrystalline silicon panels produce efficiently. May you remember and honor the scientists and engineers whose work enabled our industry, and may the foundation they built inspire us to advance renewable energy further for future generations who will build on our work just as we build on theirs.